Today's reading comes from Acts 17:22-28. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Amen. Hey, you may be seated, everyone. Hey, good morning. Welcome to Hope, everyone. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here, and as Walt mentioned, I have been away for 11 weeks, and so it is a delight to be back, though. What a gift it's been for us. I do want to say thank you to Pastor Walt and Brooklyn and others on our team and the elders who blessed our family to have this season of rest. So can we just thank them real quick as well? On my behalf, I just want to say thank you. Next week, you're actually going to hear more about kind of what we were up to during the sabbatical around this theme. But today, we're actually launching in this new sermon series. And the new sermon series is actually called Counterformed. Can I hear you say counterformed? That's right. Now, why are we saying it's counterformed? Because in the reality, for many of us, all around the world, and whether it's the media or social media or all these different voices that exist in the world, they're all shaping and forming us into something, whether it's kind of the values that we carry or the things that we care deeply about. And in many ways, whatever it is that captures our imagination as well as our affections, so many of these different voices exist out there. And it's so easy to get swept up in the ways of the world and the way that the city thinks. But what does it look like for us to be counterformed, to be formed by someone or a voice that's entirely different, the voice of God and the values that God wants us to live by, especially as we pursue following him, especially in a city like ours. Now, I recognize if you're not a Christian here, welcome. So glad you made it. I hope that whatever I have to share today would hopefully be a compelling picture of what the Christian story is about. The reality is, throughout history, different philosophers have talked about these different ways of viewing the world and human history that have shaped us and our imaginations. So, for instance, Jean-Francois Lyotard, in his book, The Postmodern Condition, he would talk about this word called meta-narratives. And meta-narratives are these narratives around the world related to history and the story that we tell ourselves that end up shaping the way that we view the world and the way that we view purpose and meaning. Charles Taylor, a Canadian philosopher, would talk about in our secular age, talk about the many ways in which our identity has been shaped by the many stories we tell us, stories of origins, of where we've come from and where we're going, and the story of purpose that may come to us. Now, I recognize some of us might be like, it's too early on a Sunday for me to be thinking about this. I just want to get to week 1 of the NFL season. Nathan's like, yes, that's me. Thank you for sharing that. Now, what does it look like, though, for us to be counterformed in the ways of what is the story of God? Now, I'm going to be touching on themes that perhaps you've heard from our church many times before. It's the story of what do Christians believe about what is our meta-narrative? What is the story that we believe in that shapes our imagination, our values, where we've come from and where we're going? And how does that impact who we are today? And how can we find ourselves in this new kind of story? So the Christian story actually begins in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. If you're not a Christian here, you've probably heard these words before. Nonetheless, it's these words: in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, that phrase begins in Genesis chapter 1, the story of the creation account. Now, what's so amazing about the Christian, the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian story of what we believe about how God created the world is that God creates the world in this poetic presentation over 6 days. Every day God creates a part of the material universe, and after each day he pronounces it good. Until the end of the 6th day, he looks back and he says, that was very good. Now, here's what's so interesting is that God, as he pronounced these words of good and very good, I'd use a word today to describe that. The word is beautiful. Can I hear you say beautiful? That's right. God would create the world to be beautiful. Now, over and against, and back in those days when the creation story came to be in the Hebrew scriptures, in the ancient Near East as well as in the Greco-Roman world, there are actually other creation myths that exist. And in those creation myths, what's so interesting is that here in the creation myth, in the Christian account, there's a story of a God who out of abundance of love and beauty and goodness looks back on creation and pronounces it good. But what's so interesting about these different creation accounts that exist within the ancient Near East as well as in the Greco-Roman world is that these creation myths are born out of conflict and strife amongst the gods. You see, and that's why the world is so messed up the way it is. And that's why there's wars and rumors of wars. It's because in the creation stories that existed within these different regions, their stories had to do with conflict and strife. But the Christian story begins with beauty. Now, here's what's so significant about this, is that the Christian lens then gives us a way of viewing the world where we can actually acknowledge that beauty exists all around us. So for instance, when it comes to the natural world that we live in, we experience beauty. So our family and I, we basically, as we were, starting sabbatical, we drove upstate, and we ended up passing through Niagara Falls before we went up to Toronto. Anyone been to Niagara Falls before? Yes, a good number of us. I mean, it is breathtaking. And so we ended up on the Canada side, and as we're walking along, I mean, there's stunning views of Niagara Falls. We could feel the mist coming about us. It was a little humid and hot, but nonetheless, we could feel the cool breeze as well as the mist. And it was very crowded, but I was just overwhelmed by the sound, the multi-sensory experience of being at Niagara Falls. So then we went over to lunch. We had lunch. And then after lunch, we came back outside, and the waterfall was still going. Some of you are like, yeah, I know, that's how a waterfall, I was just like, wow, the waterfall never ends. It just keeps going. I mean, just that moment of like the splendor of creation. I mean, have you ever had that experience before, whether it's a mountaintop or looking down on a deep valley or a canyon and something, or an animal that you've been just startled by kind of its natural beauty and the wonder of creation? See, all of us, whether you're a Christian or you're not, you've had that experience of beauty as it relates to nature. But the same is true for culture. What's interesting is that God creates men and women, Adam and Eve, in his image. And God gives this mandate to Adam and Eve. And it's basically, with the natural world that you've been given, I want you to take it and I want you to cultivate and shape the world. Almost like an artisan who's given the tools to be able to craft something beautiful and magnificent in the world around them. And so what do Adam and Eve do? They begin to actually create and shape, cultivating and shaping. I remember a few years ago, there was Twitter was blowing up because there was this one food truck that would basically give these updates about where this new food truck was going to be all over Los Angeles. This truck was called the Kogi truck. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Anyone remember this? Basically, Twitter would update a location, basically say Venice Beach at 11:43 a.m. That's where the Kogi truck would be, and everyone would flock there. And then Twitter would update, we're going to be in downtown LA at 2 p.m. or whatever. And the Kogi truck, when I was here, I was like, what's going on? I want to go to LA and find out what's going on. And it was a truck that was fusing together Korean food and Mexican food. Hello, somebody. Anyone had any bulgogi tacos before? Anyone? Yes, just a handful of you. The rest of y'all missing out. But isn't it amazing that there could be like regional cuisines and that you can fuse them together in an amazing kimchi burrito? Like, there's something about human ingenuity that's able to take the goods that God has given to us and that we're able to shape and cultivate using our imagination. In many ways, imaging who God has created us to be. But it's also in human relationships. Men and women are stamped with this divine kind of imaging of who God is. And so this is what we do. We experience beauty in all of these different facets. But I recognize the rest of y'all, but we're New Yorkers here. Life is not so peachy keen and great as you say it is, Drew. We're sophisticated New Yorkers. And it's true. The world is also full of pain and suffering. Now, where does that come from? Now, Christians aren't the type of people who simply say, oh, yes, we just bury our heads in the sand, and all we do is focus on the positives. No, that's not the Christian story. See, the Christian story actually gives an explanation for why actually pain and suffering and difficulty exist in the world as well. Life is not only beautiful, but the Christian story also describes how the world is incredibly disappointing too. See, what happens is that God has given Adam and Eve this mandate to live in this garden of beauty and to cultivate and shape it. But what ends up happening? Adam and Eve fall into sin. Now, that word sin, one of the Hebrew words that's used to describe sin is basically just missing the mark. In other words, going beyond the boundaries of what God has for us. And what happens is God gives Adam and Eve boundaries about how they're supposed to live a flourishing life. And he basically is saying, if you go beyond these boundaries, then that life of flourishing will begin to disintegrate. Now, here's what happens. Adam and Eve end up falling into sin, and the world and everything in it, this beautiful world, begins to get sullied, and it continues to start to tear apart. One theologian says this world that's neatly woven in this fabric begins to tear apart. And so what ends up happening? Nature itself, the Apostle Paul writes, nature itself, it groans. It's like anytime we see a natural disaster, whether it's floods or earthquakes or tornadoes, you see a semblance of how this beautiful world is starting to groan. But yeah, I mean, you and I have had that experience, right? Like when we ended up going to Canada, we were at this lake called Muskoka Lake up in Canada. It's this beautiful lake. And as we're at the lake, I just remember it's so vast. And as we're standing there on the side of the lake, I was just marveling. And then all of a sudden, zzz, zzz, and then I'm like, I slapped myself kind of hard there just now, but, I'm like, this is beautiful, but can we go inside? There's air conditioning in there. There's less bugs and critters to deal with. Have you ever had that experience? Or even nature itself. Yes, it's beautiful and it's disappointing. The same is true for culture. The very good things that we can create. Social media was created to connect people all over the world so that you can send pictures to grandma or granddad in another area of the world. And yet social media has also contributed to some of the highest rates of anxiety and depression in the next generation. And so the reality is the world that we live in, it's both beautiful and disappointing. This city, New York City, is beautiful, but it's really disappointing. Hope Church is beautiful and disappointing. And the Christian story is not about, oh no, it's one or the other. It's actually living into the reality of both. And it gives an explanation for both. But see, what is the story of God about? What is this meta-narrative that governs us? Look at what happens in the midst of a world that's beautiful and disappointing, and even relationships, the ones that we care about so deeply, they're both beautiful, right? The people that you love the most, you care about the most, that bring you the most joy, the people that you want to invite to be part of your wedding parties and birth dates and all that stuff, they're also the same people who drive you crazy. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Don't raise your hand. Nonetheless, right? Isn't that true? All of life is beautiful and disappointing. Now, what is God's response to all of this? Check this out. Look at what it says. The Lord God called to Adam and Eve in the midst of their own foray into beauty and disappointment and shame and hiding. God called to them and asked, "Where are you?" High five your neighbor and say, "Where are you?" Now, here's a question. Isn't God omniscient? Doesn't God know all things? God created the world. God is outside of time and space. Why in the world is he asking this question? Is it somehow God doesn't know where Adam and Eve are? Of course God knows where they are. Then why is he asking this question? He's asking this question because this very passage reveals the heart of what the Christian story would always be about. God is asking this question because it reveals how God would always, in the midst of a beautiful and disappointing world, be searching for, pursuing, looking for his people. God knows where they are, but why is he asking this question? He's asking this question so that Adam and Eve, who at this point are buried in their shame, wanting to live for self-protection, he wants to give Adam and Eve the opportunity to respond to this question and to say, God, here I am. Here I am. I'm ready to be found by you. And thus begins what the Christian story has always been about. A God of heaven and earth who created a beautiful world that would become spoiled and rotted into disappointment. And in the midst of it, to give us a kind of hope that's found in having a relationship with this God. And you see, it is these three words, beautiful, disappointing, hopeful, that the Christian story has always been about. And the reason why Jesus came into the world, Jesus being fully God and fully man, was so that Jesus came so that we might have hope. Now, here's what's interesting is that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is described as someone who's come to seek and to save. He's someone that's pursuing, is searching for, is looking after. Beautiful, disappointing, hopeful. This is what the Christian story has always been about. Now, some of you are like, did you write a book on that? I did. Earlier this year, you can take a course. We're doing it now. Yes, this is what the Christian story is about. It's these three words. It's in the midst of beauty and disappointment. How do we have hope in the midst of this? Now, here's what's so interesting, because like I mentioned, Jesus is the embodiment of this search, of this pursuit. He's the one that's seeking and saving. And if you miss it, there's all these moments where Jesus is actually like, he's constantly, there's just like these little clues in the passages about him where he's constantly looking for us, constantly looking at us and searching. Check out this story. Luke chapter 7, there's a story of Jesus, and he actually is noticing a widow who has lost her son now. So she has already lost her husband. Now she has lost her son. A woman who's probably been grieving, has probably been someone who's been neglected by society. And I love these little clues. Look at what it says. It says, Jesus, when the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her. I love that. Like Jesus, what he does is he sees people. And his heart goes out to them. You know, there's this other story of a rich young ruler in the Gospel of Mark. This person is rich. They're young. They're a ruler, so they've got social clout. I think it's probably many of you in this room. Rich young rulers. You may not call yourself that, but you're wealthy. You've got all this ambition. And what's interesting is this rich young ruler is also very religious. This person has done his best to live according to the ways of God. And he comes hearing about Jesus and Jesus' renown. And he asks Jesus, he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus is basically like, well, Jesus could see right through all of his ambition. And Jesus is basically like, well, you've heard the commandments. And he lists off a few commandments. And he says, you need to keep these. And the young person who's this well-to-do, bright, wealthy, he's like, Jesus, I've kept all this since I was young. And what's interesting is Jesus, he could see right through the ambition, the self-righteousness. And look at what it says. It says, Jesus looked at him and he loved him. He sees beyond this young guy's age and material possessions. And he sees him. Have you ever wondered, like, Jesus, he heals people, and he does it so uniquely at various moments. So, for instance, there's a lot of blind people that he heals. You know, and there's some blind people, right? Like some blind people that he's healing, and he's basically like, hey, go wash in this pool, right? And then there's other blind people where he's like, spits on the ground, rubs some mud on them, you know, and that person's probably like, can I just go wash in the pool? You know, like, can I do it that way, the way that? Well, now, why is it that Jesus heals people so differently each time? It'd be more efficient if he just said, you know what, Wednesday night from 7 to 9 p.m., we're going to offer some pizza, and we're going to do a healing of the blind day. Everyone who's blind, bring your blind friend. Like, everyone just come at one point, and let's do this to be efficient. No, but Jesus, isn't that interesting? Jesus, he does something so unique with other people. Why is that? Even his healings are so unique. You know, one of the stories that I love is there's a story of a woman who's been suffering for 12 years, it tells us in the Gospel of Mark. This woman has been suffering for 12 years. She's been bleeding in a very private area of her body. And the text tells us that she spent everything that she has had. And no doctor has been able to help her. So could you imagine the shame that she was carrying? Could you imagine each doctor she goes to gets inspected, like the way that, like the humiliating experience. And not only that, but she was also someone who was considered ceremonially unclean. In other words, if you were unclean back in those days, what you had to do was you had to say, and Walt actually preached on this a couple of weeks ago about this woman. The woman would have to say in front of everyone, unclean, unclean, get away from me. And this woman then, who's been ostracized, isolated from community. And you know, in that story, what's crazy is there's this moment, right, where Jesus on his way to heal somebody. So he's on his way, like he's going to heal somebody. And it says that crowds of people are around him. So could you imagine? He's like on his way. He's going to heal somebody. And this woman, what she does, she actually, instead of telling everyone that she's unclean or having some sort of identifier for how she's unclean, I could imagine she's just kind of bumping into people like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't tell you I'm unclean. And she's just like, if I just get close enough to Jesus, you know. And she gets close. She's heard of his reputation. She basically reaches out. She touches his tassel. Immediately, she feels the surge of power in her body. And she's like, oh my goodness, that worked. That was awesome, amazing. And I can imagine like, she's just like, inside she's gleaming. She can't wait to see whether it really worked. And she just wants to get away. You know what's crazy about this story though? Is that Jesus, who's on his way, all he had was someone touch the end of his tassel. And look at what happens. Look at what the text tells us. It says, Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Now, part of me is like, Jesus, just let the poor girl go. Like, come on. What do you mean? What are you doing? And Jesus is basically like, no, he's like, no, somebody touched me. His disciples are like, Jesus, it's like the 6 train platform, Grand Central, 8:30 in the morning right now. Like, there's people touching all of us right now. Like, let's just keep it moving. We got to heal somebody. But Jesus, he keeps insisting. He's like looking. Now, why does he keep looking? Now, if you notice, look at what happens. The woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Now, why is she trembling with fear? If this were me and I had gotten healed, I'd be like, hey, Jesus, that was me. You healed me. Hey, guys, this guy is legit. I can actually prove it to you. Listen, I felt the power in my body. But why is it that this woman is trembling with fear? She falls at his feet. And in front of everyone, she begins to share. She shares how she's been bleeding for 12 years. No one's been able to help her. This is the closest she's been to other human beings in years. And as she's sharing the whole truth, all the people around her, they begin to yell at her, snarling invectives and words and pain. Who do you think you are? What, you touch it? You didn't tell us you were unclean? You bumped into us? How dare you do that? She's trembling with fear. Why? Why did Jesus keep looking for her? Why? It's so that he could say to her, daughter, he could say to her in front of everyone, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Why does Jesus keep looking? It's because more than simply just healing her body, he wants to heal her shame. He wants to pronounce, this is his daughter in front of everyone. You know, there's something about Jesus. He's constantly looking and seeing and noticing. You know, in a city like this, it's so easy for us to be anonymous, you know, and even in a church like this, to put on our Sunday best or to have these neatly manicured kind of social media profiles or whatever else it might be. And maybe you just moved to the city and there's a part of you too that's just kind of, you felt the pangs of loneliness or the pangs of feeling like no one really sees you. And here Jesus is constantly just looking, seeing, and his heart goes out to people. There's a video that we've shown in different environments at our church, particularly with our marriages. And it's this video of Asian American young adults who are invited to spend 4 minutes of silence with their parents. And it's a video that I think illustrates so beautifully what it means to see people and to notice them. Let's watch that video now.
This was totally unexpected. Wow. Oh my goodness.
Stop to your marks, please.
Be cool. When I looked at you, it was just the day you were born.
It's like a history coming back from the time he was born till now.
지금도 생각하는 게 이제 시집 가는 그 생각만 하고 있어요, 사실. 결혼해도 같이 살아야죠. 같이. Living next door. 그런 생각이 자식에게 더 많은 걸 해주고 싶은데 못 해주는 그런 필이 항상, 그런 마음이 항상 있습니다. 예.
I just think about the amount of sacrifice that she's made in making my life better.
This is something, a moment that I will not forget. Yeah. Thank you.
to be seen and noticed. I first saw this video about 4 years ago, and my daughter was 5, and I tried it with her. It didn't work. It was bad. But I'm gonna wait till they're adults. There's something about being seen. You know, for most of my life, I felt unseen in a very unique way, because I think growing up as an Asian American in a largely non-Asian American neighborhood, first, I felt so different. So I felt seen in that our home was vandalized several times and we were bullied, and one of the few Korean Americans in our schools growing up and in our neighborhoods. So on one hand, I felt seen, but I felt unseen in that I felt like all sorts of people had stereotypes or views of me and our family. Kind of this longing to truly be known. Not only that, in my own family growing up, though, right? Like merging cultures. When my parents were part of a generation that had immigrated to the States, and here I was, this unique second generation space, and wanting to connect with my parents, and just realizing, though, that the only way to get my dad's approval or attention would be to stand out somehow amongst my brothers and I. Just this longing, though, to be noticed and seen beyond what I could accomplish or how well I could do in school. Something about being seen and known and loved. You know, at our church, we often use this image of an iceberg. An iceberg, 10% is above the surface, and then there's this 90% below the surface. And when we talk about discipleship, we talk about what does it mean that, first of all, that the God of the universe actually sees us beyond kind of the ways and the caricatures that we even make for ourselves in the city. There's a God that actually sees us and knows us and wants to be allowed into that 90% below the surface of an iceberg so that God can heal that shame. God can heal some of those anxieties and fears and ways that we've been shaped and governed around our own stories and identities, and that God can love us, that God pursues us and sees us. And again, I think in a room like this, it's so easy, in a city like this, it's so easy to be just these superficial, perfunctory types who give off an image of who we are. Meanwhile, there's this longing to really be seen and known. And maybe some of you, maybe this is your first time wandering back into church and you're wondering, does God really see me? Does he know me? And what if I told you that God, he notices, he's looking, came to seek you, and is asking this question, where are you? Where are you? And his pursuit would not end until Jesus, his son, would die on a cross to show you and me of his great love. Not even death itself would withhold his pursuing love for us.